Erev Tov, everyone. Right now, we are actually very shortly going to begin a day known as Yom HaZikaron. In Israel, it's actually already begun, Israeli Remembrance Day, and it's a day in Israel, and we mark it here, many of us mark it here in the States, remember the fallen soldiers of Israel. And whereas in other countries, you often have a kind of Memorial Day, remember the soldiers, as kind of a separate entity, and it often turns into a kind of celebratory day, which is important. You want to honor the men and women who fought to defend and found a country. In Israel, they do it in a very unique way. Yom HaZikaron goes immediately into Yom HaAtzmaut, which is celebrating Israeli Independence Day, specifically the success of Israel winning the war of 1948 that they won in March 1948 to found their country. So that important juxtaposition between honoring the soldiers who helped found the country and then celebrating it so that you actually connect those emotionally and historically. So it's a very, very powerful set of 2 days. And as we know, just a few weeks ago was Yom HaShoah, the day of remembering the Holocaust. So for Israel, I think there's this important need or by design to connect all of these historical events and how they're all connected with each other. All of these moments tie together. But one of the other things that's happening right now, it always happens at this time of year, is another historical remembrance connected to the Omer. So the Omer, the counting of the Omer, is a mitzvah from the Torah. And the Torah does not actually explain the purpose of this mitzvah. It simply says after Pesach, and again, there's some ambiguity exactly when on Pesach, but we do it on the second day of Pesach. One starts counting the Omer, and the completion of it leads to the holiday of Shavuot. So it's clear that it's connected to those holidays. It must have some agricultural significance, but again, it's not clearly stated in the Torah. But what does this mitzvah of counting days building up or down to, or building up to Shavuot, what does that have to do with Israeli Independence Day? And that is connected to the mourning practices of the Omer. But why would it be mourning? It's a mitzvah to celebrate Pesach and then building up to Shavuot. What is the significance of mourning there? And that leads to another historical event marked during this time that is not in contrast, but does not gel well with the celebration of the founding of the state of Israel. And that is that in the days of Rabbi Akiva, so these are the first centuries of the Common Era, when the Romans were in control of Palestine, or the land of Israel, there was this massive plague in which thousands of great Rabbi Akiva students died. Now, we do know of Rabbi Akiva that he was actually part of a failed rebellion. He backed a man who was known as Bar Kokhba, or Bar Koziba, and who he thought would be the Messiah, the Mashiach. And the failure of that rebellion also led to the death of many Jews. And Rabbi Akiva himself was killed as a martyr. So there's a lot of questions when the Talmud talks about the death of these students because they fought with each other and they weren't, good mensches, et cetera, like that. Is that just code for the many Jews that were killed in rebellions against the Romans? Regardless of what the Talmud really meant when it said thousands, I think 24,000 of Rabbi Akiva's students died, it still was a great tragedy for the Jewish people. 24,000 Jews who were learning Torah, fighting for freedom, whatever they were, 24,000 of our people died. And the period in which they died was between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, some of the things we assume about the 33rd day of Omer is when that plague stopped. A lot of those things developed later, but regardless, an incredibly sad, tragic, and painful event happened to our people thousands of years ago during this time of the year. And we mark that by mourning. And those mourning practices have developed and come down through history. And one of the questions is there an issue with having this great celebratory day of Yom HaAtzmaut, which again will begin, at least in the States, it'll be marked the day after tomorrow, with concerts and fun and feasts and everything like that, with the mourning practices that are present during the counting of the Omer? How do we square those two things away? So what we're going to do tonight is first, we're going to look at the development of those mourning practices, where the issue may arise. Then we're going to look at the nature of Israeli Independence Day, and that'll be very important. And then we're going to look at, basically, it's a matter of balancing values. The mourning practices, to remember the death of Rabbi Akiva's many students and those Jews, with the joy that we feel over having the state of Israel and successfully winning an incredible war that was almost certainly a miracle from God. And then we'll look at how some rabbis rule. And I will say now and repeat again later, not every rabbi is going to agree with this. We're going to look mostly at rabbis who are strongly support the state of Israel, who would be considered Zionist rabbis like myself, and representative of Lake Park Synagogue. But it's important to know that even those Zionist rabbis still don't automatically say, oh, just throw out the morning practices. They still want to balance the different traditions and laws. So the place that we'll start, Gloria and Leonard, I will go ahead and unmute you. And actually, before you read, are there any questions up until now on my introductory remarks? Excellent. So this first source here, it's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which was written again in 1563, a compilation of Jewish law. And this work, the Sha'arei Tshuva by Polish Rabbi Margoliot, he kind of gives us a very good summary of why mourning during the sphere. Again, the counting of the Omer, the counting up of those days has nothing to do with mourning. It's a separate mitzvah. But why do we mourn during it? And then this is very important. He's writing in the 18th century, he is going to list the mourning practices that have been known going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way up until this was written in the 18th century. So Gloria, please, the first source, and
as to your question as to why we don't get engaged or married between Pesach and Shavuot, and if it's because of a prohibition or not, know that it's not because of a prohibition. Rather, it's a mourning practice because of what was said by the sages. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students, and they all died between Pesach and Atzeret because they did not treat each other with respect. And they further taught, and they all died a cruel death from diphtheria. And from that time forward, the early sages had the custom not to marry during these days. But he who jumps forward and marries, we do not punish him by punishment or lashes. But if he comes to ask before the fact, we do not instruct him to marry. And as for betrothal, he who wants to betroth between Pesach and Atzeret betroths, because the main joy is the marriage, chuppah.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a number of important things here. He actually brings the quotations from the Talmud, and we see some of the ambiguity here. It starts on Sevira, the counting of the Omer starts on Pesach, which is when the death of Rabbi Akiva's students began, and it ends on Atzeret, which literally means to stop. Like if you're in the Israeli army and you want the people following you to stop, you would say Atzor. That means stop. The question is, what is Atzeret? So is that the 33rd day of the Omer, or is that Shavuot? So that's where some of the ambiguity about when the morning practices end. It also talks about this aschara, this diphtheria, this kind of sickness. And again, did that literally mean they got sick, or is it code for they were killed in a rebellion? But regardless of those ambiguities, the important thing here is, as you just read, Gloria, what are we not allowed to do? What are the morning practices? How do they manifest? We're not allowed to get
married.
Get married. And one of the important things that the Sha'arei Tshuva points out is he says it is not a halachic, it is not a legal issue, it is not forbidden, a kind of an isur, like it is asur, it is forbidden for a Jew to eat meat and milk. It is forbidden for a Jew to start a fire on Shabbat. Those are things which are forbidden, and there are certain consequences depending on when we live, etc., what the authority of the rabbis are. He says rather it's this thing called a lav, meaning don't do it. And practically the reason that's important is if somebody finds the perfect girl, we'll actually see that in the next source, and they're like, if I don't ask her to marry me now, someone else is going to ask her, and they do ask her, that engagement holds. Whereas, for example, if a brother, like in this week's Torah portion, Kedoshim, if a brother asks his sister to marry him, which is completely forbidden. It is asur, it's forbidden by the Torah. He says, well, I already asked her and she said yes, and we got married. That wedding doesn't count because they broke a law. Whereas here, by getting engaged during this time, they just broke a custom. And that is very important. It's a custom to not get married. So if someone comes to me and says, Rabbi, I asked a girl to marry me, and she said yes. And back then, by the way, getting engaged was different than today. Getting engaged in those days had legal status. That girl couldn't do anything else. Here, when we get engaged, you just buy a ring. But if someone says, Rabbi, can I get engaged during the Omer? I say, no, we don't do it. It's our custom not to do it. But if they say, Rabbi, I already got it, great, it's kosher. Yes, Jane. Just go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
What about the modern day practice of having some sort of simcha with a bar or bat mitzvah?
So we're going to come back to that
We're going
really
to come to
actually in
Okay.
the second source. But again, the key here is the only thing that the custom mentions is not getting married. And it explicitly makes a distinction. We don't get married because the joy is not getting engaged. The joy is the actual wedding. That's what we don't do. Now, again, if somebody did get married, strictly speaking, their wedding would be kosher. Again, it's not like a brother marrying a sister where it's like so forbidden it wouldn't count. It wouldn't be kosher. It's merely the custom to not do so to honor and mark the tragedy of the death of Rabbi Akiva's students. But there's a couple things that are not mentioned here. Things like shaving. And the other big one, which is having kind of what you mentioned, Jane, other kinds of parties and music and dancing, et cetera, like that. So now we're going to jump forward, not hundreds of years, we're just in the 19th century, in a work known as the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein. And he actually wrote something before this quote that I'll have you read, Leonard. And he said that during the times of the Omer, not only did Rabbi Akiva's students die, but there were additional tragedies historically during that time. And he talks about the Crusades. So he says, even if you say, oh, it's been so long since Rabbi Akiva, this time isn't as impactful, he's going to say, no, just a few hundred years ago, barely. I mean, a little more than that. Maybe it's hundreds of years at this point, but the Crusades happen. So multiple tragedies happen during this time. So there's an increased sadness during this time. And now what he does is he starts talking about getting married and getting engaged, but he starts to expand it. So Leonard, source number 2, please.
Okay, making
Shidduchim,
getting engaged, and writing
Tanaim it's basically a dowry. It's an agreement between the two families. If our kids get married, you'll give me the family cow or whatever it is like that. People do it today. It's where they smash the plate. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's not obligated. It's just a thing they used to do when dowries were more important. Go ahead.
Writing Tanaim is permitted. In each case, in case another
preemptively.
In case another preemptively gets engaged to said woman.
That's, again, the custom is not to ask a girl to marry you, but if I know that if I don't ask her now, someone else will, then the rabbi say, in that case, so you don't lose the girl of your dreams, then you can ask her. And again, we've already established this in the previous source. But now he's going to go on, and Jane, this is directly relevant to what you said. So go ahead, Leonard, and it is permitted.
And it is permitted to make a celebratory meal, but not with dancing, not with dancing. All the more so would it be forbidden to play music with instruments, and optional celebratory meals are permitted, like a meal of friendship. It's long as there is no dancing.
Excellent, thank you. So what he makes a distinction here between or not distinction. So first he says, you can't you can get engaged if you're worried that you're going to lose the other girl. And in fact, you can even have a meal that kind of celebrates it. However, the key here is that, as we saw in the previous source, the issue with weddings isn't the wedding itself. The issue is the incredible joy. It's not appropriate. And again, the mourning practices here are not all of the mourning practices. There are a lot more practices when someone loses someone during their year or their 30 days of mourning. So this is kind of like a soft version of mourning that many people do for the year, which is not have big celebratory parties, but a meal to celebrate an engagement. And then he goes on, other meals where you celebrate certain things like friendship, and certainly one at a bar or bat mitzvah, or a mitzvah like finishing. Other rabbis expand and say if there's somebody finished a book of Talmud and they want to have a meal to celebrate that, all of those are fine. The issue here is the kind of incredible wild joy that one has at an actual wedding. And how is that joy manifest? He is explicit here. It's manifest through instruments and dancing. This is really the first time that we have a source that mentions live music and dancing. And he makes a big deal. He repeats the dancing. You can have these meals, but don't have dancing. So you could have a bar bat mitzvah party as long as you don't have a DJ and dancing on the floor, etc., like that. Now, this at this point has become accepted as the custom, which doesn't mean it's you can just do whatever you want, but that is the accepted practice. However, it wasn't mentioned until the 18th or the 19th century in this work. So it's a very recent custom. And ultimately, the issue, again, it's not about the music or the dancing, it's about the joy that it represents. And you don't really dance unless there's joy. And with instruments, he is not just talking about instruments in general, specifically, it's about ones that bring joy. So you could have these celebratory meals, just don't make them wild, crazy dancing things like that. Susan, you have your hand up. You just unmute on your side and then go for it. Yeah, go for it,
Yeah,
Susan.
it seems that what they're saying is that the woman is going to the engagement thing. Whoever man is who asks her first, that's the one she's going to marry.
I mean,
I wonder whether she might not have something to say in this matter.
I think that, first of all, it's not 100% clear exactly what's going on in the relationships. I think it's more that maybe she's waiting around. Also, this might be a matter of more arranged relationships where it's not about like they're dating and they love each other. It's just a matter of, you know, like whoever asks her and the family accepts it and they make the agreements and stuff like that. It's more of like a business thing like that. Yes, the girl could say no and it wouldn't be an issue, but I don't think that's the kind of thing they're imagining. I think they're imagining, and that's why Tanaim, this dowry thing, is part of the conversation. Again, they're imagining when it's more formal and business-like, but again, you'd have to be more in that culture. But again, the takeaway is that that's not where the joy is. The joy is the wedding. And what do you do at weddings? Music and dancing, and therefore music and dancing in any kind of setting become inappropriate. But again, that's not what the original thing, though. The custom was just don't have a wedding. But the Aruch HaShulchan, he expanded upon it, and that became the accepted practice from then on. So pretty much no one is ever going to say dancing is okay, other than the case we'll talk about tonight. But there's a very interesting question. What about playing music that's not joyous dancing music? What about playing a dirge? Or what about playing a guitar because one is practicing and building up their skills? And almost every rabbi will say that if someone is playing not for fun, they're playing for a job, or they're playing because they want to practice their instrument so they don't lose their skills, that it's fine. And there are those who say, what about recorded music that's not dancing, fun, joyous music? So by looking at the original context of this, it opens up to a lot of different exceptions. However, Yom HaAtzmaut is very much what they do today, is big, joyous celebrations with live music and lots of dancing. It is explicitly what is not permitted here in the Aruch HaShulchan. Again, it's not a wedding, but the accepted custom today is a big party like that should not be permitted. Yet for many rabbis, it is. And the question is why? So before we go on to the next section, any questions up until now or any other questions? Excellent. So Susan, I'm actually going to go ahead and leave you unmuted. And this next source here, it's actually a summary from this Rabbi Meshulam Roth. So he came from Europe in 1944, and he moved to Israel, and he joined the Israeli chief rabbinate and served there for many years. So he became, a very staunch, proud Zionist. And his opinion here, his short piece here, the summary of it is very important, because not only is it directly relevant to our case, but it establishes the way that Zionist Jews approach Israeli Independence Day. And the reason I say that is because there are certain Hasidic Jews, particularly Satmar, that see the founding of the state of Israel as going directly against the will of God. God exiled us, after the time of the Romans, and God does not want us to go back and move to the land of Israel and make it a state until God sends the Messiah to do so, and to do anything else would be spitting in God's eye. Now, Satmar's wrong for a lot of reasons. They misinterpret the texts, but regardless, the Jews, there are Jews who believe that Israel's a mistake, it's bad, and shouldn't exist in its modern form. Rabbi Meshulam Roth, Zatzal, is not one of those. So Susan, if you would go ahead and take again this short summary, it's actually a translation of his piece in his work of Responsa, Hashutim Kol Mevaser. So please go ahead, the fifth day.
This is what I get for asking a question. Okay, the fifth day of the month of Iyar was established as a day of celebration throughout the land to remember the miracle of our salvation and freedom. It is obligatory upon us to celebrate it as a festive day and to say Hallel. Even one city or individuals who established a holiday because of a miracle that befell them must keep this practice, they and their descendants forever. Certainly in our case, touching on the entire public of Klal Yisrael, when we were redeemed from subjugation to the other nations and became a free people with sovereign independence, and we were also saved from being killed and destroyed by our enemies, certainly it is incumbent upon us to establish this day as a holiday. And those who set this day specifically were correct in that the principal aspect of the miracle in our redemption from subjugation to freedom occurred on this day with our Declaration of Independence.
Presumably this person is more comfortable in Hebrew, but otherwise I think it's a pretty good translation. But there's some very important things here. Now there's a conversation, I actually gave this class a year or two ago on whether or not it's appropriate to say Hallel, which we do on holidays like Pesach, we just said Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, etc. Whether it's appropriate to establish saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. And many modern Orthodox Jews will say Hallel, but they won't say it with a blessing because we basically say Hallel every morning, so you can say Psalms whatever you want. But there are many Jews who will say, no, it is a miracle and God saved us on Yom HaAtzmaut. And again, if you read the history of the War of Independence, it's really hard not to see God's hand in that war. And it's a series of miracles. And certainly it's a great thing that happened to our people. And it was very expected that we would not survive it, and we thrived after it. So thanking God is very appropriate. And Rabbi Meshulam Roth says it's not just appropriate. The Talmud establishes that when God saves us, we are obligated. It is a mitzvah to say Hallel and to celebrate that time. And that's even if it's just one city or an individual. Here, this is the entire country of Israel. And in many ways, had Israel not succeeded in the war, it would have affected Jews the world over. So this is something that positively affected Jewish people all over the world. It is at the very least an incredible moment worth celebrating. And at best, or at most, it is a mitzvah, an obligation. And that's, again, key. We're going to come back to that. It is a mitzvah to celebrate this day. Now, in the end, he does mention about the 5th of Iyar. There's a question about which day should actually be Israeli Independence Day, because the actual end of the war or what marked it may not have been the 5th of Iyar. But he says, look, all that really matters is the day that we established. And that's the day that it's appropriate to celebrate, because that's the day we agreed upon. But putting that aside, he feels, and many agree with him, it's an incredible event. That's correct, and is a mitzvah, as an obligation to celebrate it. So now we have these two competing values. There is a custom of mourning to remember the students of Rabbi Akiva and the Jews who died during the crusade, and to not have celebratory events with dancing and singing. And by the way, the dancing and singing wasn't even the original custom. The original custom was getting married. And in fact, I'm not even sure if Jews in Israel do get married on Yom HaAtzmaut. We're just talking about the dancing and singing and with live instruments, which is a much later custom anyway, and grew out of the original custom. And now this rabbi says it's a mitzvah, not a custom, it's a mitzvah to have parties. So now let's see how it comes out in the last section. And what we'll do is we'll look at two sources. The first source is a beautiful essay by this Yeshiva University rabbi, Rabbi Alan Haber. It's from a much longer piece, but I brought the relevant section. And then the very last piece is from a contemporary Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who I bring a great deal, and his work Penine Halacha, and how he explicitly rules on this matter of whether it's appropriate to have live music and dancing on Yom HaAtzmaut. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And then again, this source here is an essay in which he kind of goes through everything. And it's very cool to see how he tries to balance the different competing values. And I think now we have the tools. We've seen the original reason of the custom, how the custom was expanded, and how these Zionist rabbis, Rabbi Meshulam Roth, and many who follow him, see the value of celebrating on Yom Ha'atzmaut. So, Ken, please, another major halachic.
And another major halachic question that requires explanation involves the practice of celebrations involving music and dancing. Even though Yom Ha'atzmaut falls during Sfirat HaOmer, Yom Ha'atzmaut falls during Sfirat HaOmer, many people question how we can violate the long-standing custom of observing practices of mourning, including refraining from listening to music and dancing, in order to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut. Because of this, there are some people who may even say Hallel and eat a Suda Hoda'ah.
A Suda Hoda'ah means a meal of gratitude. And we actually saw in the Aruch HaShulchan that certain meals, these celebratory meals, would be appropriate during this time. It was just the music and the dancing that was an issue. So this Suda Hoda'ah shouldn't be a problem for anybody. Please continue.
Yeah. But do not listen to music or allow dancing. However, the standard practice in religious Zionist circles is to have celebration with live bands and dancing, in spite of the minhagim of velut for Rabbi Akiva's students. This position is endorsed by most of the great halachic authorities in this community. What is the rationale for this apparent leniency? First of all, if one accepts the position of Rabbi Meshulam Roth,
which we saw,
then it seems the minhagim of velut would automatically be overruled. This is because a minhag cannot override a mitzvah.
So just pause there for a moment. That's a very important principle. If you have a commandment versus a custom, a commandment is always going to win. It is much stronger. So if there's a commandment to celebrate the miracle of God saving us, then this custom of avelut, which is important, is nowhere near as important as the commandment to celebrate this day. Now, that's only if you go according to Rabbi Meshulam Roth, which many do, but not all do. And he'll come back to that as well. So please continue on Rabbi Akiva's.
When Rabbi Akiva's students died, a minhag developed to observe the practices of mourning in their memory, and this was entirely appropriate. However, once these great miracles took place, the intrinsic obligations of Hallel and Simcha override the minhag, just for those days, of course, because of this stronger halachic status. However, even those who recite Hallel without a bracha, and thus presumably do not accept the existence of an intrinsic mitzvah, are generally lenient with the practices of velut. The rationale for this is that one minhag can override another if there is a legitimate reason, and a new minhag of simcha can and should override the previous minhag of velut. Indeed, it can be argued that a failure to suspend the practices of mourning in order to properly praise Hashem for the great miracles he performed on those days would represent a fundamental lack of gratitude. Additionally, it is important to note that the original takana of velut referred only to haircuts and weddings. The practice of prohibiting other forms of dancing and celebrating is of more recent origin. Therefore, the practice in most religious Zionist communities and institutions is to celebrate with singing and dancing, shavach v'choda'ah,
which is praise and gratitude. So there's two important arguments here for those who celebrate. One is a legal one. If Rabbi Meshulam Roth is right, it is a mitzvah, and that automatically in a legal standing overrules a minhag. But what about those who say it's not a mitzvah? We want to say Hallel, we want to celebrate, but we don't see it as an actual command. So like I said, they say the Psalms of Hallel, but they're not going to say it with a blessing as if there's a new mitzvah, as if there's a new established holiday. So essentially they're saying it's a custom to celebrate this day. But we have another custom. So here we're not really in legal status. We're in what they would say hashkafa, which is kind of a philosophy, and the way that you think about it, and it's about stacking values. And here he's arguing that the value of celebrating and gratitude towards God, even if it's not commanded, should overrule sadness. And what's interesting about that second conversation is it's not black and white. A mitzvah always rules a custom. End of story. A commandment always overrules a custom. There's no argument there. But if you two competing customs, it really is an open discussion about which is more important. Now, I agree with him. I think the value of gratitude for a miracle is a higher value, but at the same time, we don't want to forget those who who have died, those who have passed on, and remembering them. So it's an interesting and open conversation. But as he said, what's been decided is in the religious Zionist communities, both in Israel and in America, it's been accepted that the custom of joy overrules it. And the other thing that he throws in there, he's like, by the way, the whole singing and dancing thing is very, very recent. So we shouldn't go so crazy about this. Maybe with hair cutting and weddings, okay, that we could be more strict on. But the singing and the dancing, that only came about in the 19th century. So why are you losing your minds over it? It is a custom, but come on, it's not the original custom. So what he's doing is he's stacking those values together to validate the second opinion. And that's important because not everyone sees Yom HaAtzmaut as a new commandment, as a commanded holiday to say Hallel with a bracha. Many do, and this is no problem for them. But for those who don't, they do need a rationale to be able to do it. And so he brings in a couple of different values. And what I didn't mention here is does Yom HaAtzmaut overrule those other things? So with weddings, I don't recall what the custom is, but with haircuts, Rav Kook, Zatzal, the great Rav Kook, indeed insisted that his students who do regularly shave and stop for the Omer, that when it comes to Yom HaAtzmaut, if again, they usually would shave, that they should shave for Yom HaAtzmaut. And many rule that on Yom HaAtzmaut, if it's somebody who shaves every single week, then they definitely should for that day. And that means it overrides even one of the original customs going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And the last source we'll look at, and then we'll kind of take some questions. And Jane, I will unmute you, is again, this contemporary one from Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. In many ways, it kind of summarizes it. But again, this is an explicit ruling in a work of halakha written for an Israeli audience, but it also kind of brings everything together very nicely. So Jane, please, source number 2 from Rabbi Eliezer Melamed.
After Yom HaAtzmaut was established as a day of joy and thanksgiving, the question arose, do the customs of mourning that we observe during the Sfirat HaOmer period apply to Yom HaAtzmaut? The halachic authorities have expressed their opinions in both directions. The accepted practice is not to keep customs of mourning that diminish expressions of the joy. Therefore, it is permissible to dance and play music. However, one should not make a wedding on that day because avoiding weddings is not considered an expression of mourning that clashes with the joy of Yom HaAtzmaut.
There you go. Just saying to somebody, oh, don't get married on Yom HaAtzmaut, that's not going to take away from the day. So that's the answer there to that question. And I do remember that he goes on, the reason that shaving is something that many hold that one can and perhaps should do is that the reason one doesn't shave, and this goes all the way back to the Torah, it is, for men specifically, it is an outward sign of mourning. One who is unshaven appears as if they are in a state of mourning. So on Yom HaAtzmaut, if somebody's not actively at a wedding getting married, no one's going to say, it's Yom HaAtzmaut, why aren't you getting married right now? But if they see someone who's unkempt and unshaven, they would say, it's Yom HaAtzmaut, it's Israeli Independence Day, why aren't you shaven and clean looking? Here's your guitar. So that's the distinction there. Just because someone's not getting married doesn't matter on Yom HaAtzmaut. But if somebody doesn't shave, it might show that they don't fully express the joy of the day. So and again, he is a religious Zionist rabbi. So if you asked a Satmar Chassid about the day, he would rule very differently if he would even talk to you. But the religious Zionists, and again, many modern Orthodox rabbis, and by the way, religious Zionists and modern Orthodox are not the same thing. Rav Linzer actually spoke about that. I think when he came here at my installation, they're not the same thing, but they do share a lot of values, particularly around a love of Israel and a recognition that it is a religious, miraculous event that we have and should celebrate the state of Israel. So whether or not because part of this goes to the conversation about establishing new commandments to say Hallel. So one side says that's great, Rabbi Meshulam Roth, and then there's no question we should absolutely celebrate. And by the way, on those days, not for all the Omer. It doesn't overrule the whole Omer. It just overrules the days which we mark as that holiday of Yom HaAtzmaut. And even those who say, I don't know if I feel comfortable with creating new commandments and obligations, but this is a joyous time, a miraculous time. I think we should have a new custom, which that's okay to create new customs, but this custom we feel should overrule it. Again, certainly it should overrule these more recent additions, dancing and music, et cetera, like that. but also as Rabbi Haber says, just the idea of this more recent joy should be more powerful and close to our hearts. We want to celebrate joy. Not that we should forget those we have lost tragically, but it really is very important that we show gratitude for God above all else. That's why we wake up every morning and there's a custom to say, Modeh ani, grateful am I God before you. Gratitude before everything. In fact, even when someone does pass away, what's the prayer that we say for them for 30 days of the year? The Kaddish, which says nothing about a person being lost. It's literally gratitude for God. We thank God that we are still able to honor, connect, and remember this person. So gratitude for God and that which God has given us above all else. So you've seen here both a legal conversation and one about values. And regardless of which side you take, Yom HaAtzmaut is an incredibly important moment in the history of our people. And even those who are opposed to it recognize the significance of it. They just question about how we should celebrate it and what the future of our people should be. But if you ask Rabbi Dinan, Rabbi, can I play guitar or drums or kazoo on Yom HaAtzmaut? The answer is 100% yes. And if you play well, you can dance along to it. But as soon as Yom HaAtzmaut is over, put the kazoo away and let your beard continue to grow long.